Your zip code shouldn't predict how long you live, but it does. Our children need clean water and healthy food, safe places to learn and to play, and access to medical care so they can live long, healthy lives. Let's work together to improve our communities. We have the power to make health happen in our neighborhoods. La salud empieza aquí.
In 2011, our team of legislative attorneys nationwide, from the nation's capital in D.C. through the state capitals in Austin, Springfield, and Sacramento, have been incredibly busy in trying to turn back so many of the anti-immigrant proposals that have targeted our community. I think that that effort has, by and large, been successful.
As we all know, the anti-immigrant rhetoric hits across the board and has had such tremendous impact. But the work that MALDEF has done and the work that Tom has done in showing that this Constitution is to work for every single one of us has been so very effective.
Regrettably, following Arizona's enactment last year of SB 1070, 5 other states in 2011 followed suit. Arizona and these 5 other states, which I've labeled the dirty half dozen, have retrogressed, have gone backward for our nation in challenging long-standing constitutional precedents and principles by enacting laws that they clearly have no authority to enact or enforce. And so MALDEF has taken on a leadership role in challenging these laws and ones like them at the local level. I think the most extreme manifestation of this trend by too many unscrupulous leaders to target the Latino community through its most vulnerable members, the undocumented immigrant population, has been an attempt to change our Constitution in various ways to take away the right of those born here to citizenship. I think it's critically important that as a nation we resoundingly reject these efforts, and an important step toward that end was taken by the American Bar Association, which adopted unanimously through its House of Delegates a resolution that MALDEF put forward together with others that would reaffirm the legal profession's belief in long-standing interpretation and application of the Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment.
I personally and my community has benefited by the work that MALDEF has done in redistricting and reapportionment, and it's continuing to do so. The Latino community would have no representation, or at least the extent, the level of representation that it has in Congress today, in state legislatures as well as local government, had MALDEF not had a presence in the issue of reapportionment and redistricting.
And MALDEF has been involved in a nationwide campaign to inform and educate community members about how to be involved in their state and local redistricting process, how to provide input about communities of interest that ought to be kept intact, how to provide important input about the obligations under the Federal Voting Rights Act. Redistricting is a critical step to greater involvement and greater input in governance. But for that to occur, those who are drawing the maps have to ensure that districts are created that permit the Latino community, through its voters, to express its choice and have that choice result in election and representation.
But we still have much work to do. And I think that MALDEF, with the role that it's taken on, the aggressiveness that they've on, the kind of lawyers that they have at the table, are ready to go out and fight many of those battles.
So I'm proud of the efforts of our policy staff, of our legislative attorneys nationwide, from DC to all of the state capitals, in working to ensure that we have laws that better protect the civil rights of Latinos and better serve our national interests in inclusion and incorporation of all communities in our future progress. But we also recognize that the opportunities to push back on those who would seek to restrict the rights of Latinos, who would seek to restrict the application of our long-standing constitutional principles and values, those opportunities, coupled with the challenges of a growing demand for our services, is something that the dedicated staff of MALDEF is looking forward to pursuing with great vigor throughout this decade.
Our community benefits by MALDEF's work. Tough work to do, but it needs to be done, and there's only one organization that can get it done, and that's MALDEF.
And thank you all for being here, even in the rain. Coming out for this important discussion is something that we definitely welcome. This is the second Latino State of the State event that MALDEF has hosted. A year ago, at the first ever Latino State of the State, just on the other side of the state capitol, we discussed the then very ripe opportunity to turn California into a shining alternative, a golden counterpart to the neighboring state of Arizona, which at that time had so recently enacted the infamous SB 1070. The opportunity, if you will, to create a very real geographic juxtaposition of California representing justice and Arizona representing injustice. In the intervening year, we have made progress toward that goal. In part through the efforts of MALDEF and its allies, the legislature and governor have taken important strides in creating this state as a true counterpart to Arizona. To cite a few examples, the enactment of a bill that would prevent local agencies, local cities and counties from requiring any employer to use E-Verify, the extraordinarily flawed and discriminatory employment verification system that under federal law is a voluntary system. Nonetheless, there were 18 jurisdictions in California that by the time this state law was enacted had sought to enact and enforce requirements that contractors or those doing business in a city use E-Verify. This bill now being implemented prevents those laws from being enforced. We also made progress through the enactment of the first limitations in state law on the notorious practice of setting up checkpoints and impounding the vehicles of those who are unable to obtain driver's licenses due to the decade and a half in which we have failed to provide an opportunity to so many who have contributed to our society to obtain a driver's license and to freely drive a vehicle. We also, of course, saw an improvement, a much needed improvement in the ability of farm workers to seek collectively fairer wages, fairer working conditions from their employers. And of course, finally, after waiting many, many years, we saw the enactment of the California DREAM Act, for the first time providing scholarship support, financial aid to students who by their sacrifices through our public school system and beyond have demonstrated their willingness and ability to lead this state and are only blocked by the failure of our federal government to enact needed progressive immigration reform. But despite these measures of progress and others, we still have challenges in creating California as a state of justice in comparison to its neighbor in Arizona. We failed to enact limitations, though they were presented, on the notorious Secure Communities program, which despite its name, seems in design and effect to render certain communities, specifically Latino communities, insecure by sweeping within its coverage those who are innocent of any serious wrongdoing, those who may be convicted of nothing, but nonetheless through secure communities are thrust into the apparatus of deportation run by our federal government. We also have still failed in California to explicitly enact protections against discrimination on the basis of citizenship, language, immigration status, whether real or assumed, by private parties. So we still have work to do, and at MALDEF we will work with our allies in and outside of state government to move closer toward that dream of a golden state of justice, a golden state of integration and recognition of the contributions of those who have lived here, even without status, for years and contributed to our economy, to our society, and have raised our future leaders in their homes, in their children. Indeed, this goal of a golden state of justice, of immigrant integration, is really all about children and their future. The overarching goal of every immigrant I've ever met is to ensure that their children have a better future, a better life than they have lived. They come to California and indeed to the rest of the United States to pursue that dream. So the most that we can do in California to create that golden state of justice would be to focus on the children, not just the children of immigrants in this generation, but the grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren of immigrants from other generations who make California their home. We ought to make it a goal in this state that even in tough economic times, we will work to arrive at equity of opportunity for all children in California. We will not use budgetary and revenue problems as an excuse for failing to take the steps to ensure that children who are young today will live their entire lives, the remainder of their childhood and into their adulthood, in a state of equity, equality of opportunity. That is a pledge that we at MALDEF will seek in this year and the coming years to make real. That pledge to ensure that we arrive at a state of equity for children, including Latino children, in particular for Latino children, is a whole community imperative, an imperative for the entire state, particularly here in California. In the last school year, 2010-2011, 51.4% of public school children in California were Latino. A majority of the public school students in this state from this point forward will be Latino. Our pledge, our promise to them to create a state of equality of opportunity is critical not only for their futures and that of their families, but for the continued success of this state, of this golden state. But when we talk about equity, equality of opportunity, we must recognize that we will not have achieved equality of opportunity or access until we see greater demonstrations of equality of outcome. We must reject the false dichotomy that sets up opportunity and access as different from outcomes. We must reject the silent, unspoken intolerance in the implicit assumption made by too many that a fair system, whatever system, that a fair system can still result in the kinds of disparities that we see in leadership positions, whether elected or appointed, in positions of influence in our economy, in business, and in labor, disparities at the tops of our universities and colleges. When we see those continued disparities, we should know, as a matter of faith and rationality, that we have not arrived at equality of opportunity. There is no area more critical to this pledge than education itself, where we must work to close the infamous education gap, the achievement gap as it's sometimes known, by ensuring that we have aggressive and ongoing oversight and monitoring from the state level to ensure equity of opportunity and equity of outcome. We must look not only at the critical inputs of education, as this state has for years, a leader through the Serrano case in ensuring some greater equity of financial inputs to education. But we must know by observing the inequality of outcomes in education that there is still more work to be done. And in undertaking this, we must know that equality and equity of outcome is not only measured by a test or by multiple tests, but we must measure our success in fulfilling our pledge by looking at outcomes in terms of graduation, access to high-level coursework, access to enrichment programs, college going, and college completion. We must recognize in fulfilling this pledge that it is our obligation to take equality of opportunity and see it made true in reality of educational excellence in outcomes. In fulfilling this pledge, we must remember that it goes beyond kindergarten through 12th grade, that we still have work to do in higher education as well. Although we've taken strides through legislation authored by Senator Padilla and others, thank you for being here, to ensure that our community colleges do not remain the dead end that they have been for too long in this state, particularly for our Latino students. We have work to do to ensure that the Student Success Task Force fulfills its mission of ensuring that more students complete the coursework they've undertaken, complete the transfer curriculum, move on to higher education, or complete the certificate program that they have commenced. But we must look beyond the Student Success Task Force and champion legislation that will ensure, through funding mechanisms if necessary, that there will be greater success in the community colleges that are the gateway to a bachelor's degree for so many in the Latino community. In fulfilling our pledge, we must also recognize that too often equality of opportunity in education is outside of the traditional K through 12 system. Through disparities in discipline highlighted so poignantly a week ago by the Civil Rights Data Project of the federal government, we know that too many Latino students and African American students, through suspension and expulsion, receive their education outside of, for at least a portion of their career, the traditional K through 12 school. We must ensure that these alternative settings provide adequate education to put those students back into their regular schools with an equal opportunity to use their abilities to succeed and go on to college. At the same time, of course, we must ensure that those disparities in discipline, in suspensions and expulsions, are ended. In fulfilling our pledge, we know that it is most assuredly about investment. We cannot fulfill equality of opportunity for Latino students in the state of California if we continue to disinvest in public education. Regardless of the budget and revenue problems that we face, we must overcome them to ensure that our investment in our future, in Latino children and non-Latino children in this state, is vigorous and successful in producing the equality of outcome and equality of opportunity to which we must pledge. We know that disinvestment is not a state of justice. Inattention to inequality of outcome is not a state of justice. Diversion from these critical issues to focus on other tired disputes between stakeholders or otherwise is not a state of justice. If we are to achieve the golden state of justice, the true juxtaposition between this state and its neighbor, we must fulfill that pledge to ensure that we achieve equality of opportunity as demonstrated by much, much greater equality of outcome. To achieve that golden state of justice, we must have investment, we must have focus, we must have attention. That's my pledge on behalf of MALDEF, to work with our leaders and allies throughout the state to ensure that we can fulfill that pledge of equality of opportunity and outcome for all children, including that majority who are now Latino children. So with that, we'll now talk about some of the focus that we need to achieve the golden state of justice with our esteemed panel members. They're going to give us the focus. very pleased to have with us this afternoon, beginning to my right, Pablo Alvarado, a very good friend of mine who is the national coordinator of the National Day Labor Organizing Network. Under his leadership, NDLON works throughout the country with its affiliates to advocate for the rights of day laborers, to advocate for the establishment of economic opportunity and civil rights for day workers and their allies throughout the country. Thank you for being here, Pablo. To his right, it's my pleasure to welcome Mary Lou Fulton, Senior Program Manager at the California Endowment. The California Endowment's mission, as you saw from the videos that began our program, is to expand access to affordable, quality health care for underserved individuals and communities, and to promote fundamental improvements in the health status of all Californians. Thank you for being here, Mary Lou.
Thank you.
Claudia Peña is the statewide project coordinator for the California Civil Rights Coalition, a coalition that I have the great pleasure of leading as one of the steering committee co-chairs. Claudia, in her own right, has already emerged in her short tenure as a leader in the state on all civil rights issues, but particularly in weaving together the often disparate concerns of civil rights organizations, activists, educators, lawyers, other progressive advocates, working on a range of issues to get them to work as one to create a just and healthy society. Thank you, Claudia. And last, of course, but certainly not least, we have Tim Szilard, who is the president of the Rosenberg Foundation. Under Tim's leadership, the foundation is putting resources into innovative new solutions in the areas of immigrants' rights and integration, farm worker rights, and civic participation. Tim, thank you not only for joining us, but for sponsoring this critically important program. I talked about the golden state that is California. When I travel around the nation, the tarnish on California's shiny reputation largely comes from the budget crises we have faced in recent years. Claudia, the CCRC has made this issue one of its focuses. How does the budget problem affect civil rights concerns?
That's a good question. I think it affects civil rights concerns in two ways. The first is there are several services that are provided by the state as a result of championing civil rights by different groups. So these are services such as housing rights or access to folks with disabilities, and of course education. And all of these services have been cut over the last few years, some as far as 50%, 60%, sometimes even 70%. And that's obviously affected the Latino community, since the Latino community makes up almost 40% of California, and as Tom mentioned, 50% of the students in the public education system. The second way in which it affects civil rights is that there are foundations and private funders who have funded civil rights organizations in California over the course of time. 501c3s get much of their funding from these sources. And those are the organizations that engage in civil rights on a different level: racial justice organizations, environmental justice, organizations such as MALDEF, immigrants' rights organizations. And they have seen a reduction in their funding because many of those foundations and private funders are now serving the purposes that the state of California used to serve, right? So the state of California used to provide certain services that are no longer being provided because of budget cuts. And so those foundations and private funders have to move in and fill those spaces, which means that the organizations that are doing civil rights work at the 501c3 status level are no longer being funded at the levels they were once before. So that results in a reduction of access to civil rights in California across the board entirely.
Tim, it seems in politics like the one area of government service that is immune to budget cutbacks is criminal justice and law enforcement. Is California's criminal justice spending serving the state and its Latino community well?
Simply no. California spends more than any other state in the country to incarcerate more people than anywhere in the world, and we have abysmal results. As everyone knows, we are second in the country in terms of our recidivism rate. That's the rate at which people reoffend when they come out of our prisons and jails. it's fully 70% in California. And our enormous over-incarceration rates in California are disproportionately impacting Latinos and other communities of color in really egregious ways. And that disproportion is actually only accelerating as you look at people who are younger and younger. So for instance, 2 years ago, Latinos represented 55% of all juvenile arrests in the state of California. So we see a trajectory that, unless we make real change, is only going to get worse. To get back to your question about fiscal impact, we're spending about $14 billion a year in California, largely for incarceration at both the state and local level. And we know that what we've done to enable us to spend that kind of money on incarceration has been to disinvest in education, in health access, in drug treatment, in mental health, and in crime prevention, all of which are investments which are far less expensive than what we spend within the criminal justice sector, and actually have far better results when you look at their impact on reducing crime and keeping communities safe. So I think we've been doing a lot of things that haven't worked well. I think we face an enormous moment of opportunity to have a very deep conversation, pivoting off of the governor's realignment proposal, about really making some fundamental shifts in our priorities within criminal justice and freeing up some of those dollars to reinvest in the kinds of programs and services that we know are going to have both near and long-term much more effective impacts on keeping communities safe and ensuring that we can have the kind of outcomes in education that you talked about in your address.
Thank you. Now, Pablo, speaking of law enforcement, in California today, there are law enforcement agencies that are being conscripted involuntarily into a new element of law enforcement, namely immigration enforcement. Talked a little bit about the Secured Communities program. What are the impacts of secure communities, and what should we do about it in California?
Yes, day laborers are having it very hard in California right now. There are 30 day labor centers in California, and they are being defunded as we speak. That means that many day laborers have actually gone to the streets to look for work. And while they're in the street, they face many issues. And one of those problems they face is the fact that police officers come and arrest them or ticket them for soliciting employment on public right-of-ways. And lately, many police officers, police departments, and sheriff departments have implemented the Secure Communities program. And I can give you some of the numbers of the statistics that the implementation of this program is generating. But before I do that, I want to share a story that happened last night. Last night, we received a call from Univision. They wanted us to talk about how to educate, how to inform their laborers, how to protect themselves when they are hired by employers. And the reason why they wanted us to do that was because a week ago, a day laborer in Fullerton was hired, was taken to a private home. After a hard day of work, the employer refused to pay his wages. And instead, he called the police and accused the day laborer of robbery. The cops came and they arrested the worker. He went and saw the judge, and the judge dismissed the charges because there was no evidence of that. But now the day laborer is facing deportation. He has a 5-year-old baby, and this is the actual impact that it's having that this program is having in our communities. Giving that kind of authority to police officers is a lot, it's too much. And some of the numbers are really scary. And I think like California is failing its immigrant community. Just since the inception of the Secure Communities program, about 169,000 people have been deported through this program nationwide. 65,000 from California. That makes it about 39% of all deportations through the Secure Communities program come from the state of California. And we need to change that because it's generating so much suffering in our community, destruction of families. You cannot, it's very difficult to understand when kids are left without their parents. So this is the suffering that we want to address, and we are very lucky to have Assemblymember Tom Miano, who has introduced the Trust Act, which would prohibit that police officers or sheriff deputies participate in the deportation of people who haven't been convicted of a felony or a violent crime. I think we're going to be pushing very hard this year in Sacramento. This is the way that we can make it better for Latinos, and it's, even though they, undocumented communities, it's one of the most vulnerable sectors of the Latino community. If we don't protect the most vulnerable, it's going to affect everybody. And I think supporting the Trust Act will make it better for all.
Thank you. Mary Lou, even aside from immigration enforcement and programs like Secure Communities that sweep innocent immigrants into the penal system, too many Latinos end up in our penal system. Often the road to incarceration starts with problems in school. I mentioned in my remarks that last week the Federal Department of Education released data showing higher rates of suspension and expulsion for Latinos and African Americans, dramatically higher rates. The California Endowment focuses on healthy communities. How did the California Endowment get involved in this issue as a matter of community health?
Well, I'd like to start by asking everybody to think back to your years in high school. Times when maybe we didn't have the best judgment, when mistakes were made, and when maybe we got into trouble a few times, and maybe there are some troublemakers in the room here. I'm not sure. I know there are some troublemakers on this panel. But if you were like me, you were fortunate, and you had somebody near you who helped you when you got into trouble, who helped you to see when you made a mistake and learn from that, and to help you to stay on track. In California schools today, it's a totally different situation. Today, for some of the things that I did, and maybe some of the things that you did, you could be suspended or expelled. The numbers that we see are shocking. Over the last 3 years, more than 2 million suspensions and expulsions issued by California schools. The majority unrelated to violence or drugs. They're related to the type of misconduct that used to be handled in a different way in the principal's office or with a school counselor. And instead, we have this harsh response, this unforgiving response to what is a natural thing that happens with young people who make mistakes. We see examples that defy common sense. An 11-year-old boy in Bakersfield goes to the playground, chases a cute girl, hits her on the backside, runs away laughing, gets expelled for sexual battery. True story. In Los Angeles, we see police going to schools, waiting for children to be just a few minutes late to high school, giving them $250 truancy tickets. 88% of those who receive the truancy tickets are Latino and African American students. We did not know about this until young people and community leaders in the disadvantaged neighborhoods where we work told us about it. And they said, this is wrong. If you want to remove a road, if you want to help us to knock down this roadblock to health and opportunity, this would be a great place to start. And we agree. We think it's unacceptable, and we think it's time that we all became more aware of this issue and we did something about it.
Let me ask you this, Mary Lou. You asked us to think back to high school, which for some of us is a long time ago. And of course, when I was in high school, I was the model citizen. But is this use of harsh discipline that we didn't have back when we were in high school, but that we have today, is it just a school-based expression of being tough on crime? Or how did we end up to this point where we're applying these penalties of suspension and expulsion so disproportionately to students of color for behavior that's, as you've described, not violent, not related to drugs or other crimes? How did we get here?
I think there are a number of reasons. You know, Tim was talking about the incarceration system. I think we have a culture of punishment that we live in this society where we think the right thing to do when someone does something wrong is to enact harsh punishment and hope that will work. In schools in particular, the Columbine shootings were a key moment when suddenly schools became afraid and they thought the best way to make schools safe would be to bring law enforcement to school campuses and to impose very harsh and automatic punishments. So that certainly was a factor. I think also, though, we can't overlook the pressures that are on our school system with the budgets, large classroom sizes, inexperienced teachers, particularly those who work in underserved communities, the test scores. We hear anecdotally that there's a big spike in suspensions the day before tests are given. Why? Because there's such a pressure on those test scores, and the children who might cause some disruption or they might be perceived to cause some disruption are removed. But the racial disparities in particular, research has shown, are associated with misconduct in which there's a lot of discretion on the part of the teacher or the administrator to decide whether you should be suspended or expelled. In California, 44% of the suspensions and expulsions last year were for something called willful defiance or obscenity. A lot of people don't know that in California you can be expelled for profanity or obscenity. But in those cases where suspension and expulsion decisions are in the eye of the beholder and where you don't like how I looked at you and you decide that it's time to suspend me from school, that's where we see the greatest racial disparities. And that's true across the country.
I'll avoid my inclination to respond with an expletive to where we've ended up in this situation. But I think what you described as a culture of punishment even seems to apply outside of schools. And Pablo day laborers seem to have been at the forefront of some of that, where things as simple as speech, engaging in activity like that, ends up being punished, or cities attempt to punish it. What challenges have day laborers faced in this state with respect to city ordinances, with respect to law enforcement cracking down on activities that, if engaged in by someone else, would be permitted, if not even celebrated or welcomed?
Well, thanks to your work, and thank you for representing us throughout these years. And thanks to Tim and the Rosenberg Foundation for funding the campaign to overturn the anti-day labor solicitation ordinances. I think the Redondo Beach struggle has been an exemplary fight and an example that when humble people decide to take their destinies in their own hands and fight back, that they can win. The day laborers in Redondo Beach decided to be plaintiffs in that lawsuit. They overcame their fear. They marched. They went to the courtrooms. They became subjects in the struggle to defend their rights. And by doing that, not only were they able to protect their own rights, but everybody else's. Now with the economic downturn, we have U.S. citizens and legal permanent residents coming to look for work in the sidewalks. And the reason that they can do that is because the undocumented day labor protected the Constitution. And I think this is why second, third, and fourth generation Latinos need to support the undocumented community in these moments of difficulties, because by no means day laborers are going to be different now that they're still looking for work in the streets. They still face even security guards that are hired by the business owners. Cops still have many tools that they can use to bar them of the streets. They will implement laws like blocking the sidewalk, jaywalking, etc. They will find ways to do that. Wage theft will continue to prevail, particularly now that people feel. Some employers feel, because the mistreatment of day labor has been normalized in a way in many parts of the country, they feel empowered to come and hire workers and not pay them, or call the cops when they don't want to pay them. So that will continue to take place in the street corners, and of course, we will continue to fight back. So things are going to be difficult, but I think we are better, the day labor community, because in a way we have our organizations now. we have an ability to defend ourselves more and more. And I think, like, you know, as I said, it's very important that second, third, fourth generation Latinos support us in this struggle. When SB 1070 came up in Arizona, everybody thought that it was just for the illegals, you know. But what ended up happening is that, you know, Sheriff Arpaio engaged in massive racial profiling tactics. He didn't distinguish between the undocumented and people with documents, U.S. citizens. So there are many cases like that, you know. So what I can assure you of is that we will fight back as much as we can here in this state and beyond.
I think it's important to note that despite the Redondo Beach decision, where the day laborers did step forward so courageously, and highly publicized decision by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, 9-2, and bank decisions striking down an anti-solicitation ordinance, that there are still over 40 cities and counties in California that continue to have anti-solicitation ordinances on their books. So still work to be done even at that basic level. Speaking still about this culture of punishment, the heightening of criminalization and punishment, Tim, in your previous comments, you talked about realignment, one approach to begin to decrease this heightening of criminalization and punishment, but that could also serve as a partial solution to budget problems. How can realignment and other reforms serve our best community interests?
Well, as I mentioned, Tom, I think we're at a real watershed moment. I think we have a clear understanding among the public. Vast majorities of Democrats, Republicans, and independents have indicated time and time again that we're over-incarcerating, we're spending too much money on business as usual and not getting the results that we ought to be getting. So in a sense, our public and all sectors of our public is significantly out in front of some of our policymakers. And so I think it's a real opportunity for coalition building and to really look at some fundamental shifts in the way we do business. Realignment provides the opportunity to do that, and the governor and the legislature have provided each county the funds to supervise and manage at least about 30,000 people over time who used to be sent to state prison, and another 55,000 people who used to be on traditional parole and who are now going to be the responsibilities of the counties. And it's a real opportunity then, instead of rebuilding at the local level the mistakes that we've made at the state level, instead to change our way of doing business and make those serious investments and take those dollars, invest them in creating a real infrastructure of community supports, mental health treatment. We know that over 60% of the folks in our juvenile justice and adult criminal justice systems have serious mental health issues that need to be addressed. Well, if we really want to change what's going on with those folks, we need to address those underlying issues. We need to rebuild our systems that provide mental health treatment, drug treatment, and again, make a shift in what Mary Lou was talking about and Pablo in terms of this culture of punishment. And should some folks be punished? Of course. Some folks need to be locked up, of course, to keep us safe. But we need to stop using this cookie-cutter approach that considers every minor offense to be a serious offense and to be treated as a serious offense. I want to make one a point about what Pablo was just talking about, because I think it's critical, which is that this culture of punishment, and in particular the steps that we've taken through secure communities and other measures that enlist local police officers and sheriff's deputies as secondary agents of immigration enforcement, I think pose real threats to public safety. And I think you'll find that many leaders in law enforcement recognize that and have deep concerns over that. Because as someone, I was a prosecutor for 12 years before coming to foundation work, the most critical thing to do is to build trust in communities, and in particular in communities of color and immigrant communities for whom there are very real fears about coming forward to report crime. And that has direct impacts when crime goes unreported, when people are afraid to come forward because of immigration consequences, when there are language barriers that get in the way of people cooperating and participating and having strong relationships with law enforcement. That's bad for everybody. It's bad for the communities directly impacted, and it's bad for everyone's public safety. So I think we have to get past this false choice that's really been presented to us about being tough and realize that sometimes what appears to be tough, in particular in this secure communities kind of an immigration, criminal justice nexus, is actually deleterious to our public safety.
So, Claudia, Tim talked about realignment as one opportunity to change our paradigm as a result of the budget crisis that we're in. We wouldn't have realignment without that. But certainly some of the other solutions that the state has been forced to not only explore but implement have had much more deleterious effects on vulnerable communities. You talked a little bit about that before, but can you talk a little more about how the cuts that we're facing, because we haven't solved this broader revenue problem, affect critical services?
Sure. The governor's current budget has a $9.2 billion budget gap, and he proposes over the next 18 months to solve this with a 50% an attempt to raise revenues, which we can talk more about later if you like, and 50% cuts in services that the state provides. About 50% of those cuts would be on health and human services, so that includes deep cuts to CalWORKs, which is, for those of you who don't know, one of the programs that's really important that's probably going to be cut the most is the parents' ability to access welfare to work. And most of these families will be moved over to a program called Child Maintenance Program, which reduces the cash that's available to families with children. Then another, about 11% of the cuts will affect child care stipends that parents receive. And about 21% will be cuts to education. And this is a big deal because, as you likely already know, California ranks around anywhere between 46th and 50th, depending on which measure you're using to gauge education services in California. So we're 46th in per pupil spending. We're 50th in adult to student ratio, and that means teacher to student, administrator to student, librarian to student. In each of those, we rank 50th. So where the budget is right now, if the governor is successful in this 50% cuts, 50% revenue solution that he has for the budget gap, we will be spending about $1,000 less per pupil than we were in 2007, and that's success for this year. And if he's not successful in increasing revenues as planned later this year, then that drops about $750 per pupil, which means that we'll be ranking closer to 50th than 46th by the end of the year. So those are huge cuts to critical services, and Pablo said something that made me think. He said, you know, when humble people are willing to fight for change, that, you know, things can happen. And these cuts, the cuts that are proposed are to folks that are struggling with poverty, students, the elderly, disabilities. These are all communities that are vulnerable and don't have as much power and resources to fight back, right? So we don't see golf courses being closed down in California. We see education, which we are already terrible at in California, being cut more and more and more. So, you know, it's critical services in California are going to continue to be cut until we do something about it.
One of those services that you've really given us the details about the cuts are schools. And as a member of the Los Angeles County Board of Education, I see it at every meeting, how schools are struggling with not just the reductions, but the uncertainty about what will be available. So we have this problem, Mary Lou, that you've identified, that the data has begun to shine a light on with respect to disparate discipline, harsh discipline. How can schools address that problem, change the paradigm, if you will, when they're so hard-pressed to implement new programs or do anything new given the uncertainty that the economic situation creates for them? What are the solutions for schools in 2012?
Well, the good news is that there are solutions that we know work. We know that harsh punishments do not work. They do not make schools safer. They don't help students succeed. There's zero evidence that zero tolerance is the way to go when it comes to school discipline. What is the way to go is to first think about how do we prevent misbehavior from happening in the first place? How do we get ahead of the problem by teaching good behavior and positive behavior from a young age? There are some very simple and inexpensive solutions that we know work. So we start early. I think that though it's, you know, as children grow up, as we all did, we will make mistakes. And so when children misbehave, we have to create ways for them to learn from their mistakes. to connect the consequences to the behavior. When you just throw a child out without creating that accountability for what they did and that opportunity to learn, you weren't solving the problem and you weren't making it better. And lastly, we just need to bring awareness to the problem. I think that, as I talk to people individually about this problem, people often say, oh yeah, that happened to me. I was talking to somebody here in Sacramento last night who I said, talked about what I was going to be doing today, and she said, oh, I got suspended. My teacher accused me of something I didn't do, and then I cussed at her, and I got suspended for 5 days. And you know what? My sister got suspended too. And then she proceeded to tell me like every relative she had gotten suspended. So I think we all have a role to play in, one, calling attention to the fact that this problem exists, and two, to say we can do better. We know what works, and it's time that we get to work in addressing this very, very solvable problem within our educational system, unlike so many others that seem so overwhelming.
Of course, many of the problems in education do stem from the cuts that Claudia has talked about, but our budget revenue shortfall hit hardest because of the Great Recession, which still affects families across the state, especially low-income families. Tim, would you talk a little bit about some of the work the Rosenberg Foundation is doing on behalf of low-wage workers, some of those who are hit hardest by any economic downturn?
Sure. I think there's some incredibly exciting work, and certainly Pablo and Endelon, as well as with your support, Tom, you've been doing a tremendous work together. I think that we're seeing very active engagement from organized labor in a way that is new and very exciting around willingness and excitement to start to work with low-wage workers. I think because of the economic downturn that you mentioned, many of the sectors of the economy where people could make a living wage are now really so much on the edge that it's really, for most folks, very analogous to the life experience of day laborers. And in many cases, you see more and more folks who are, in fact, day laborers entering. So where we see in the inland counties, Riverside and San Bernardino, which is the second largest warehouse district in the world, most folks don't even know is here in California. You have many folks who are being employed at below living wage, who are routinely harassed, who are prevented from organizing or asserting their labor rights, and who are often victimized by wage theft, which is a very serious offense, which is basically not paying somebody for the time that they've worked. So enforcement on that end, I think I would like to see some more punishment and a more punitive approach as a response to some of those crimes which are already on the books. But beyond the day labor movement, beyond the work that's being done that's very exciting in the warehouse industry, you also have growing work that's being done with the car wash workers starting in Los Angeles. We now have the first 3 unionized car wash shops in Los Angeles, and as anyone who knows who's been to Los Angeles, there are a lot of car wash workers in that city, so it's a great place to start. And another area of this movement that I think is incredibly exciting and promising is work on behalf of domestic workers. California is home to 200,000 immigrant domestic workers who, because of a legacy of how labor law developed, both domestic workers and farm workers were originally left out of the basic protections of federal labor law. It was basically a historic trade-off to the southern states and grew out of the legacy of slavery, but now persists today and has very severe consequences, in particular for immigrant communities. But we have the opportunity in California to pass the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights. We'd be the second state to do that. And I think it's a very promising opportunity to make a real difference in the lives of domestic workers who are here, but also strike a blow for justice and create the kind of state you talked about that can be a model for the rest of the country. And finally, farm workers. This continues to be a very, very significant sector of our economy that has been overlooked largely, I think, in a lot of our public discussions about where our food comes from and where conditions for farm workers, unfortunately, have not changed and in many parts of this state have really deteriorated from where they were 30, 40 years ago, when actually there was more conversation about farm workers. We need to make sure that farm worker families earn a living wage, are afforded basic labor protections, and child labor in the fields is also addressed by having that living wage be possible for families. There's an exciting project there. I'll just mention briefly that has been a coalition. I'm very excited about some of these new coalitions that are developing around this work. So this has been a coalition among environmental organizations, farm worker justice organizations, as well as labor and children's organizations and some others, to create a new set of labor standards and eventually to empower consumers when we shop and to work with retailers to make choices the same way that folks do around buying organic produce or buying what's called fair trade in terms of produce, the labor standards by which food is grown and produced in the developing world, to apply the same kind of standards here. And I think it's a really promising opportunity to engage the public at large and consumers in exercising their perspective on justice through their own consumer behavior. So there's a lot that I think is tremendously promising and exciting.
Pablo, you talked about some of the issues that day laborers face with law enforcement, whether it's about ordinances or secure communities or other disparate arrests. You also did mention a little bit about wage theft, but how are day laborers being affected by the Great Recession? What's going on in worker centers and on corners around California, and what can we do about ameliorating some of the economic conditions that are faced?
Well, the first thing that I would ask is go and visit hireadaylabor.org, and you're going to find where the day labor centers are in the state of California, and give a day of work to a day laborer. There are men and women who work very hard in those centers. That's the first thing that I would say we can do to at least make it better, particularly during this month. It's usually November, December, January. Spread the word. Tell people that these are hardworking men and women that are ready to do whatever they have to do to feed their loved ones. Of course, you know, there are many other things that are affecting day laborers, and I think I want to think bigger. I want to think of the immigrant community at large, because what, in my view, and you said it better. You said that in the face of Georgia and Alabama and Arizona, we need to have a California that is an example for the entire country. What's happening right now is no more than the Arizonification of the country. And it is unfortunate that the Obama administration has fallen into this trap by promoting this program, this Secure Communities program and the 287G program, which is exactly what led to SB 1070 in Arizona. There are many things that we can do here in California, and one of them is support the Trust Act. But there are also, at the local level, you know, even though that the program has been turned into a mandatory initiative, there are ways that to persuade police officers, to persuade police chiefs, and we're working with police chiefs in several places, including Santa Clara County and other places, where you know, police officers and police chiefs understand that if they continue in the road of enforcing immigration law, they're going to erode the trust that people have in their police officers. That's why the Miramonte school parents didn't report the abuse that their kids were going through, because they didn't trust the cops. And I think, like, honest cops who want to do their job well, they don't want to engage in that. So there are ways to talk to legislators so they don't have to honor what they call the detainers. So every time that a person comes into jail and they suspect that this person may be undocumented, ICE would actually ask the sheriff or the police, can you please hold that person until I get there? Well, municipalities don't have to honor those detainers. Santa Clara County has made the right decision. I think, like in other places, we can do the same thing. The entire debate has been poisoned with hatred and bigotry, and because of that, you know, instead of comprehensive immigration reform, what we're having is more criminalization at all levels. You know, and we have to, in the absence of immigration reform, and we know that nothing's going to happen this year. You know, we have to make sure that we decriminalize people at the local level. So ensuring that people have access, that workers have access to unions, to apprenticeship programs, to English as a second language classes. That's part of how we need to fight back against you know, the criminalization of migrants and people of color in general. We have to make sure that people have access to the institutions that administer justice, that if a worker doesn't get paid, he or she has the legal remedy to recover those wages. That's the way we're gonna win against the attrition strategy that our adversaries are pushing throughout the country.
So we've talked about the Trust Act, which is basically an effort to establish state policy about when, in only appropriate circumstances, those detainer requests from ICE should be honored by law enforcement. Tim, you mentioned the Domestic Workers Bill of Rights. Let's talk a little more about legislative solutions in California. Mary Lou, you've talked about this issue of disparate discipline. How is California grappling with this issue? Are there solutions, legislative, that are being pursued?
Well, ultimately, the change has to happen at the local school, at the local community level, but there are things that state government can do, and now there are 5 different pieces of legislation that have been introduced here in Sacramento that are addressing different aspects of the problem. One, for example, addresses this issue of willful defiance that I mentioned that's responsible for so many of the suspensions and expulsions, and says that, one, you can no longer expel a student for being defiant of school officials, and second, that you can only punish that through an in-school suspension, not removing the student from school. We know the most important thing we can do is to keep students in school. So that's what that proposal is aimed at doing. Another one looks at monitoring of schools that have very high rates of suspension and says if you are suspending more than 25% of your student body, and there are schools that do that, that you then need to apply a different approach. The one you're using now is not working. You need to apply a research-backed, proven approach that will actually help to reduce the misconduct. Another one asks school administrators to be more specific when they remove a student from school in saying what they did before removing that student to try and help them, so that suspensions become the last resort, not the first choice. So all of these measures are before lawmakers now, and it's encouraging to see them being considered.
Thank you. Claudia, when it comes to the big issue, the lack of revenue in this state, and you've talked about the impacts of that on some critical human services, what are the legislative solutions that go to the legislature of the people that we might be facing later this year?
So by legislative, by the people, you mean ballot initiatives? This is always my favorite part, talking about solutions. I always feel like it's so doom and gloom when you talk about the budget. I wear all black.
Except for your shoes.
That's the hope, the Golden State. We can be the Golden State again. And it's a really exciting time in California. So in the 1970s, we had a revenue surplus. This created a backlash for California voters. They got really angry about all the taxes they were spending since California had so much money. And then it created what's been 30, 40 years of California voters who are completely anti-tax. But given all the budget crises over the last few years and people taking to the streets and the 99%ers and everything, Californians are finally ready to talk about taxes a little bit. That's so far what all the polling has shown. Who knows? Californians are fickle. But the polling shows that Californians are ready to take on revenue because, as you likely know, the California budget crisis is not a spending problem. It's a revenue problem. So we need more revenues in California. So since Californians are where they are, there's a lot of groups currently jockeying for a position on the ballot this November with an attempt to increase revenues. And right now there's 3, maybe 4 groups that will battle it out in the streets, attempting to collect signatures for their own ballot initiatives, and we'll see what ends up on the November ballot. And those 4 are the following. The first is the governor's. And his initiative proposes 2 different things. One is a 0.5-cent sales tax increase, which I think would raise $1.7 billion. And the second portion of his initiative would raise $5.76 billion, and that would be what's considered a millionaire's tax. So his would include anybody who's making $250,000 or above would see an increase in their income tax. And I think that his creates 3 different levels of increases in income tax. So altogether, his initiative would raise $6.9 billion towards the 2012-2013 budget in California. And then the second one is called the millionaire's tax. It's the original group that did a lot of polling on increasing income taxes for millionaires. Their initiative would raise about $6 billion, and they propose to increase by 2 percentage points anybody making above $2 million, and increase 3 percentage points, this is income tax, for people making between $1 and $2 million. And the money that they would make from this initiative will be put out to education and local governments, public safety, infrastructure. The governor's is supposed to go towards public safety, K-12 education, social services, higher education, and corrections. The third initiative that is out there collecting signatures right now is called Our Children, Our Future. It is the Advancement Project down in Los Angeles is behind it, and their idea is to increase personal income tax for Californians across the board, with the exception of the very poor. So that would mean an increase in personal income taxes for probably most people in this room. On average, about $222 increase in your own taxes per year. That would raise $10 billion, and they propose to put all of their money towards K-12 education. Some of it would also go to bonds, and so from the general fund, the money that's going towards bonds would be opened up to other things, and I think that that estimate was $2 billion, but please don't quote me on that, reporters. But for the most part, the entire amount would go to K-12 education. And the last initiative, I actually haven't seen it out there collecting signatures just yet, but it's something being proposed by a man named Tom Steyer, who wants to close certain corporate loopholes so that corporations are paying more of their fair share of taxes, which is not currently happening in California at all. So those are the ones that you're probably going to be asked for your signature for, and in November we'll see what happens. But I'm very hopeful that at least one of these, if not 2 of these, would pass. There's an idea out there that Californians aren't willing to pass more than 1 revenue increasing initiative, but we're actually currently working on some polling and some focus groups to figure out whether or not that's true. So cross your fingers.
Well, we're getting close to the end, so I'm now going to ask all the panelists in 1 minute or less, whether it's on the ballot or in the legislature. Sometimes members of the legislature, not any of the ones who are here, but sometimes members of the legislature need some demonstration of public support, public mobilization. All of the solutions that we've talked about, and I'm glad we've talked about solutions, are going to require some mobilization of the populace. So in 1 minute or less, I wonder if you, thinking of all of these progressive measures, what can folks here do or watching do to contribute to that mobilization that's going to get us closer to enacting these solutions? Because as we all know, it's not just a good idea that gets the solution enacted. So, Tim, you first.
I think one of the most exciting developments, and I mentioned it briefly, and that everyone here and watching and listening can contribute to, is really a new conception of how we work across constituencies in coalition. We know that, for more than 10 years, California has been the 3rd and, of course, by far the most numerous, what's called majority-minority state. And so the power is there in numbers. There's no question. And certainly when you include with communities of color, folks from organized labor, other progressive communities, the LGBT community, you have enormous unharnessed power. But what we haven't seen is that potential power be translated into actual power and actual policy change. So I think the more that we can have what are very hard but very real conversations across constituencies to identify the intersections and the common interests and the way that we can work together, as opposed to seeing this is my set of issues and that's your set of issues, and any time or resources that I put into those sets of issues is somehow taking away from mine, and instead really build a durable and powerful majority that reflects those numbers, I think then the sky's the limit about what we can do to create a just California.
Claudia, how are we
Tim stole
mobilizing?
mine. I work at a coalition.
And Claudia is doing just that.
I think the one suggestion I would make for this audience is that when people think about the budget crisis and taxes, they think, too much, it's overwhelming, I don't get it, I don't want to know anything. And maybe not anybody in this room. But it's a topic that's really, really important, that's affecting us all every day, all day. And to the extent that you can learn just a little bit more about the way budget and taxes work in California, I think would go a long way, and share it with one other person. Californians are known for not wanting any reduction in their services and also not wanting to pay 1 more cent. I don't really understand how that's going to work. So, and that clearly that comes from a place of not really understanding the way things work. So whatever it is, our coalition is going to put together a really accessible, cool, whatever, artists are making it, video on the way taxes and budget works. So once that comes out, watch it, and then you'll have done your little piece today.
Mary Lou.
Well, I think with the school discipline issue, the most important thing that everyone in this room can do is to tell somebody about it, because so few people know that it's happening and know that there are solutions both locally and at the state level that can really help make it better. So please spread the word and tell a friend. The other thing I think we can all do, and especially encourage every young person we know to do, is to register to vote and to vote. Until we all fully participate in our system of democracy, we will not see power change, and we will not see outcomes that are dramatically different until that happens.
Pablo.
You know, our adversaries have been, for over a decade now, probably more, trying to make the lives of migrants so miserable so that they can't pack their bags and leave on their own. And Mitt Romney has adopted this strategy with the self-deport concept. We have to repudiate this strategy at all levels. And there are different ways of doing it. It's not just, sometimes we reduce social change to public policy modifications. And that's essential that we do it. And here in California, we have the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, that we need to support it fully. We have the Trust Act, and there are other initiatives that will benefit migrant communities. But at the local level, there are many other things that people can do. Because while our adversaries are pushing for the exclusion of the most vulnerable members of our community, we have to push for the inclusion. And there are different ways of doing that. And people can actually do it at the school board. People can do it in the school districts, and making sure that migrant parents have access to counseling in those schools. Making sure that workers have access to union jobs with union wages and working conditions. We're working on that, on developing stronger alliances with labor unions, making sure that day laborers have the ability to look for a day of work. Because we may have won against the first generation of anti-day labor ordinances, they're coming with a second wave, and we have to be prepared. And that is, I think, a challenge that we're ready to take on. Even with the limited resources that we have, we'll keep the fight up. So please, let's work together to alleviate the suffering. The number that I gave you is not a lie. This number, I didn't invent it. Okay, we had to challenge the Obama administration in court because they didn't want to give us the information of how many people they were deporting. They were telling us, well, the majority of people that we're deporting are people who have committed violent crimes. Well, we asked them, where's the information that tells us that? They gave us the information. It turns out that 70% of the people that are being deported under the Secure Communities Program have committed no crime at all, or a very minor traffic violation. And this has to change. 39% of the people that are being deported in our state, the state that is supposed to be the example for the entire country, come from here. And we have to change that reality. And I think it's a challenge for all of us. And it's not just about the undocumented community, it's about Latinos in general. People see the laborers as the face of the undocumented community, and sometimes they are deemed as symbols of the broken immigration system. Many people in the country see Latinos as the face of immigration too. So it's not just about the undocumented, it's about all of us. And we all have a role to play. So there are many initiatives that you can participate both at the local and the national level.
We are all in this together. Please join me in giving a round of applause to our distinguished panel members. If there's one thing that our discussion today makes clear is that we have challenges, but we have many great ideas for solutions. It's a matter of mobilizing together to make sure that those solutions are put in place so that we can arrive at that place where California is a golden example of justice. One thing that I would suggest folks in the audience can do around mobilizing is convince one person or one or more persons from your family, from your neighborhood, to watch this Latino State of the State program on a webcast at www.maldef.org. With that self-serving plug, I want to thank all of you and our panel for being with us today to talk about what we can all do together to reach that state in California of justice. Thank you again.